Introducing Heather Nancarrow. So she's the CEO of ANROS, Australia's national research organisation for women's safety. So Heather has 35 years experience working on the prevention of violence against women, including direct service provision, policy, legislation, research and professional development. Heather has held many leadership roles at both the state and national level in regards to the prevention of violence against women. She was co-deputy chair of the Council of Australia's Government's Advisory Panel to Reduce Violence Against Women 2015 to 2016. In 2014 to 2015, she was a member of the Queensland Premier's Special Task Force on Domestic Violence and Family Violence. And in 2008 to 2009, she was deputy chair of the National Council to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children, which produced Time for Action, the blueprint for COAG's national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. Heather has published 3 book chapters and numerous peer-reviewed articles nationally and internationally on violence against women. Heather has a Master of Arts in Criminology and Criminal Justice with first-class honours. Her primary research interests are justice responses to violence against women, particularly as they relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Her PhD research on the unintended consequences of domestic violence laws is currently under examination. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you. Great, thanks very much. Could I just ask everybody to stand just for a minute, please? Thank you. While you're standing, I'd like to participate in the ancient and wonderful tradition of acknowledgement of country. And I'd like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal elders, past, present, and the future generations of elders here on this beautiful country. It's a privilege to be here on the Ngunnawal country, and I would also like to thank the organisers for inviting me to be here. I'm glad that you were able to stand for that acknowledgement of country, but really I just wanted you to be able to take a little break and get energised for the rest of the for this period before afternoon tea. But so you can sit again now. But I actually do think it's fitting to stand for acknowledgement of country and respect the elders. And I'd also like to pay respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be present here today. I also am going to change my plan somewhat, not because my USB is riding around a taxi, but because I've just been so stimulated by the discussion this morning, and I thought that I might draw a little bit on that PhD research that I've recently submitted for examination to expand on the points that Philip was raising, because I think he's made a really important point that does challenge, I guess, some of our thinking and the work that we've been doing and work I've been doing over the last 35 years. And I have to say that for the first 15 or so of those years, as a feminist, I identify as a feminist who've been working in this field for a very long time, and I certainly have a feminist analysis, but these days I'd call myself an intersectional feminist. After the first 15 years, I started to critically think about what it is we were doing from the perspective of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, particularly in Queensland. I was being challenged by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women directly and indirectly about the work that we were doing and the way in which we were undertaking our research, and that led me to an interest in intersectionality and led me into studying in criminology and criminal justice in particular, and using critical race theory and other critical theories to examine the work that I'd been doing and others were doing in this field. What I want to do is draw, I suppose, just to draw out a bit from my PhD research before I will return to the prepared presentation, because that's important too. But I really think it's important to, if I can, clarify some of the points that Philip was making, but from a different perspective. So what Philip was talking about, or what I took from that, was the fluidity between perpetration and victimisation of violence, which occurs for the LGBTI community, as Philip discussed it, but also in Indigenous communities, as my research and my experience in working with Indigenous women has taught me. So what I did for the research was that I had access to court files and linked to police reports of cases of 185 people who were not not only had been subject to domestic violence protection orders, but had been charged with breaches. So these were a group of 185 people who were not only likely to be charged, but were in fact charged with breaches of orders. They were divided into roughly equal numbers of 4 groups. So I had in that sample of 185 Indigenous women, non-Indigenous women, Indigenous men and non-Indigenous men. And so I was able to do a gender and race analysis of court data linked to police reports, and I also conducted interviews with police prosecutors and with service providers in my 2 research sites, which happened to be Cairns and Mount Isa in far north and far west Queensland. And those 2 sites also provide services, as you would know, many of you would know, I think, that the Cairns Court and the Mount Isa Court also provide or deal with cases from the Cape York and the Gulf of Carpentaria, so remote Aboriginal communities brought into those courts. So I had some of those people in the sample as well. So what I found, so what was going on for these people, that they were being charged with breaches of orders. So first of all, they were subject to protection orders, so that there'd been some evidence that they had perpetrated violence against their partners. They were all, by the way, intimate partner violence cases, because I wanted to be able to do as best as possible comparison, so not looking at domestic violence or family violence cases comparing to intimate partner violence, but standardise that. So apart from discovering that whilst across the whole of the state, police applications in Queensland account for about 61% of all applications, in those sites, in my research sites where there are higher Indigenous population, police applications were about 80% of all applications. So the higher the Indigenous population, the higher the proportion of police applications as a percentage of all applications. And that was particularly true for Indigenous women. Indigenous women were significantly more likely than any other group to be the subject of police applications that brought them into the criminal justice system as perpetrators of domestic violence. What I did then, and based on the literature around, and drawing on Evan Stark's work in particular and the distinction he made between coercive control and fights, and I think that there's been a lot of work done on typologies. Johnson's got 5 different typologies and they're very problematic for a whole range of reasons. Ellen Pence and Shamita Dasgupta also developed a set of typologies that were largely consistent with Johnson's. But I think the more the typologies are broken down, the more problematic they become, because people don't fit into neat little boxes, and you can say, well, this one's coercive control, but that one's separation instigated violence. It's very tricky and very dangerous. However, I think that Evan Stark, his work around coercive control and fights is very helpful. He makes that distinction for reasons different to those of mine, because he's operating from a North American context, and he's arguing that the feminist agenda stalled because we didn't make that distinction in the law. But in Australia, we've always identified non-physical forms of violence, and America hasn't. So we come from different points of view about why we need this analysis, but I do think we need it. So what I was able to do, based on the literature and based on what was coming out of the interviews with service providers and police prosecutors, I analysed the police reports with looking for elements of the different kinds of characteristics of coercive control versus fights. And I found that 88% of the non-Indigenous men were, in fact, based on the description of police reports, there's limitations to this research, as there is with any. However, I found that 88% of the men in the sample could be classified as having perpetrated coercive control, which is what brought them into the criminal justice system. 68% of the Indigenous men perpetrated coercive control. You won't be surprised probably that 95%, and thinking about the numbers of women, so the great majority of the women, Indigenous and non-Indigenous women, were brought into the criminal justice system through the domestic violence law because of fights. The other aspect of the fights, and I want to pick up on some of the points that Alan made earlier today about the, if you think about the context, the social context, or the social determinants of violence in the lives of people, and you think about accountability and what that looks like for different, whether it's coercive control or fights. But then you start to break down fights and you start to look at the circumstances of Indigenous people in some of those remote communities, where I also identified, particularly from the interviews with service providers, some of whom, about half of whom, were Indigenous themselves, and the police prosecutors. Indigenous fights could also be further broken down to some extent into chaos context violence, which what I'm calling chaos context violence, where a high degree of poor mental health, substance abuse, acquired brain injury, homelessness, absolute devastation in their lives, and violence being perpetrated by these couples. And some was also linked to, I also drew on research from the 80s and 90s by Marcia Langton about traditional Aboriginal dispute resolution, and this is not a custom, an excuse, a cultural excuse for violence, but rather recognising that in traditional Aboriginal culture there were some forms of structured violence or expressions of aggression or expressions of anger that were expressed via in a physical way, and that weren't associated with gender. So when we think about aggression, we associate it with masculinity. In traditional Aboriginal culture, according to Marcia Langton, and also Victoria Burbank and Nancy Williams, the expression of aggression isn't linked to femininity or masculinity in traditional Aboriginal culture. So we've got a completely different perspective on the meanings and uses of violence in Aboriginal culture to begin with, first in terms of some cultural aspect, but also in terms of the, this chaos context violence that's going on. And here we are, we as a white feminist, I claim to be one of, I'm one of them. I was there, one of the young women in the early 80s lobbying government for the establishment of domestic violence task force investigations, and we need laws and all of this, and we got them. But what we premised those laws on was really coercive control. We had in mind a particular kind of violence, we had in mind a particular kind of perpetrator and a particular kind of victim. And the victim needed the state to come in and take control of the perpetrator because the victim was relatively powerless. This is all still true for many cases, 88% of the non-Indigenous men in my sample. But it's not true for some men, and particularly for some Indigenous men, and potentially others, but my research, I'm just drawing from my research here. It's certainly not true for women. But we are using the same law, and we've removed discretion from police. Well, certainly in the case of the Queensland law, where police can make applications without the consent of the victim. Some of these cases, like one of the cases in the police reports in my sample, was a case of a man and a woman, Aboriginal man and woman, on the Esplanade in Cairns. I don't know if you're familiar with that place, beautiful parkland right on the waterfront. A group of Aboriginal people sitting around drinking in the park. A fight ensued. She hit him with a thong, then he hit her back, and then they got up and they were running around a bin, in a boxing stance, throwing punches at each other, running around the bin. So this is a mutual act rather than a unilateral act at that point. This woman, Thelma, I call her Thelma, that's her pseudonym, had been breached 5 times. Each time, except one. So 4 of the 5 times that she'd been charged with breaches of domestic violence orders, the incident had been captured on CCTV. No one called the police. Peter, her partner, as I call him Peter, he didn't call the police. He didn't need state intervention. However, the police saw it on CCTV. They had no choice. District police policy is that if in doubt, take it out and let the court decide. Courts have 3 minutes to make to consider, on average, to consider an application. If it's a police application, they tend to rubber stamp it. So this is what we've done. This is what we've created because we, as young white feminists advocating these laws, didn't take account of Indigenous women's perspectives on violence and uses of violence. And so we've constructed their partners, when they're engaged in fights, we've constructed their partners as victims of violence. The law constructs them. The law we created constructs them as victims of violence and the women as perpetrators. So we've got a problem that we need to fix. And, in the meantime, Indigenous women are increasing in numbers in the criminal justice system, and partly because of their uses of violence and the way in which we interpret and construct victims of violence and the powers that we've given to police and courts to intervene in people's lives without their consent. And so that all came from a very good place, and I'm not arguing that we don't need to continue to do that, but we need to recognise that there is this, that sometimes the boundaries between victimisation and perpetration are blurred, but I argue that if we were able to better distinguish between coercive control and fights, we might be able to find a way through this conundrum. So, Hannah, how long was that? I know, but I haven't really started my presentation yet. But but I really thought it was important to, I suppose, to help. I don't know whether. Hopefully, that has clarified a little some of the points that Philip was making about the, it's not always clear. Perpetrators can also be victims, and victims can also be perpetrators. But I think it's important to distinguish between, they're men predominantly who perpetrate. Sorry, coercive control is almost exclusively perpetrated by men, but fights men and women engage in. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my topic, holding perpetrators to account. So what is a perpetrator and what is accountability? What does it look like? And I think that when we think about those scenarios that I've just talked about and some of the points that Philip made earlier, it starts to throw up some challenges for us about what accountability might look like. And I think that in the past we've tended to conflate accountability with punishment or with court or legal intervention, and to some extent that is holding people accountable. But in fact, another point that I would argue is that the formal criminal justice system actually encourages men to deny, minimise and blame rather than take responsibility. So in some ways, the formal criminal justice system enables some men to avoid accountability, whereas some innovative justice models might be better placed to be able to hold men accountable in ways that are meaningful for them and their partners. So I think, I just wanted to make that point about, when I say holding perpetrators to account, that's not without its problems. The reason I use that title is that that's part of the work, the mandate we've been given at ANROS to develop a program of research for improving evidence to support the implementation of interventions, or particularly the implementation of the national outcome standards for perpetrator interventions. So I'll just go back briefly to explain that ANROS is an initiative under the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children. We've already... Oh, that didn't work. Have I got it back to front? No. I'll just use this. There you go. So that's basically my presentation overview. I don't need to read it. So the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children is a 12-year plan. It's to be implemented through a series of 4 3-year action plans. The plan is 2010 to 2022. We're about halfway through. ANROS has just completed its first 3 years, and we're just still delivering on our first program of research out of our core grant. So our core grant is funded by the Commonwealth Government and every state and territory of Australia. And they've pooled their money, their resources into one centre, our centre, and that for the purpose of being able to build a solid, pool of evidence. I mean, no one jurisdiction could fund the quantity of research that they're able to do collectively through ANROS. So really, that's the reason for our existence. Our strategic goals are: 1, to deliver high quality, innovative and relevant research; 2, and equally importantly, to ensure the effective dissemination and application of the research findings. So we have a role, our knowledge translation and exchange role, in facilitating the take-up of evidence in policy and practice. And build, maintain and provide collaborative relationships with and between stakeholders. And our 4th strategic goal is about being an effective and efficient organisation so that the bulk of our resources can be directed to evidence building and knowledge translation and exchange. So our operating model is very much around three core intersecting functions: knowledge production, knowledge translation and exchange, and leadership. So in addition to the core grant funding that we have from the Commonwealth and all of the states and territories, we have a number of other sources of funding, mostly, well, at this stage, all government, but individual jurisdictions. So the Victorian government has funded ANROS to develop the Victorian Family Violence Index, which we've subcontracted to the University of Melbourne. The Queensland government has contracted us to develop a risk management framework and information sharing system for their trial integrated response in Queensland as a result of the Special Premier's Task Force, the Bryce Report as they refer to it now. And we also have we've had funding from the Commonwealth for some specific projects, and we've got a big bucket of money, well, relatively, $3 million from the Commonwealth Government for the development and implementation of a program of research on perpetrator interventions. Now, we had undertaken, and I'd like to acknowledge Tony Fletcher, who worked as a Senior Research Officer at ANROS in the early stages of the development of this program, and undertook the phenomenal groundwork for the research that we did, the foundational pieces on the current state of knowledge of perpetrator interventions in Australia and the mapping of perpetrator pathways through the justice system in each of the 8 states and territories of Australia. So we'll just come back to the perpetrator interventions research stream. It's $3 million in Commonwealth funding. It was a priority of the second action plan of the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and their Children, and we're about to launch the third action plan of the National Plan. We had hoped that we would be further through the implementation of the research program than we are. However, the Commonwealth Government view was that it needed to be linked to the national outcome standards for perpetrator interventions, and therefore we couldn't begin to the process of calling for grant applications and finalising the strategic research themes that we would be calling applications for until the national outcome standards for perpetrator interventions were released by the Council of Australian Governments, and that happened in December last year. So we called for applications in February. People go away on their breaks, or if they're applying for grants, they're applying for ARC and NHMRC grants at that stage. So we decided to wait till February, and we closed the applications in April. So the pieces of work that that's the National Outcome Standards for Perpetrator Interventions. That's what it looks like. You can get a copy on the DSS website. I'm probably not going to go into much detail about that, but if people have questions, and I know that Leon was very much involved, and Janet as well, in the development of the NOSPI. So essentially the NOSPI are 6 high-level national standards set by the Council of Australian Governments, applicable across the policy program and service systems. The standards are, number 1, women and their children's safety is the core priority of all perpetrator interventions. Perpetrators get the right interventions at the right time. Perpetrators face justice and legal consequences when they commit violence. So here again, thinking back to what kind of violence, what kind of perpetrator, what do we mean? Perpetrators participate in programs and services that enable them to change their violent behaviours and attitudes. Number 5, perpetrator interventions are driven by credible evidence to continuously improve. And number 6, people working in perpetrator intervention systems are skilled in responding to the dynamics and impacts of domestic, family and sexual violence. So we move to the 2 documents that I referred to earlier that Tony was very instrumental in delivering. Landscapes, ANROS Landscapes, a State of Knowledge papers. So the first one, part 1, it considers the large body of Australian and international academic and grey literature on perpetrator interventions with attention to the history, development, various types and effectiveness of perpetrator interventions for sexual assault and family and domestic violence. This includes an extensive review of literature on perpetrator programs, but it's not limited to perpetrator programs. So it's interventions more broadly. Part 2 examines the perpetrator pathways through the civil and criminal legal systems in all states and territories in Australia, providing an overview of key legislative and policy frameworks in each jurisdiction for both sexual assault and domestic and family violence. in addition to mapping several specific programs in each jurisdiction against these pathways. The key contributions of this work to the evidence base are that, first of all, it identifies the multiplicity of perpetrator interventions beyond programs and specifically legal interventions by agencies. It identifies points of referral to other systems such as the mental health, drug and alcohol, housing and employment services in recognition that these systems may play a role in assisting men to stop perpetrating violence. It highlights where the system may lose sight of perpetrators by identifying points of contact between perpetrators and the system as they move through the various interventions. It illustrates a number of specific points where there are opportunities for referral or contact with partners in each state or territory, recognising that women's safety is the top priority. And it highlights the need for extensive further research on what works and for whom within the Australian context. Further, it identifies a shortage of programs in rural and remote areas and a shortage of services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and particularly those in remote and rural areas. So when Thea talked about the lack of diversity in programs in Melbourne, in Victoria, when you multiply that by the whole of the country and you look at some of the states like Western Australia and Queensland that have vast areas of remoteness and higher Indigenous populations in very remote communities, then we've got a real challenge to deal with, apart from the distinguishing what kind of violence are we actually dealing with here, but also being able to deliver programs that are meaningful in those contexts, given resources available and distances involved, and being able to recruit facilitators with appropriate skills and be able to retain them in those communities. So there are a number of challenges on a number of levels for us in thinking about how best to do that. So one of the key findings from the State of Knowledge Part 1 was that placing intervention programs within a wider system is crucial in terms of holding men accountable for their behaviour and for the voices and perspectives of women and their children to inform the development of programs. So we've heard about Gondolf's the system matters, and certainly the research reinforces that point. Both domestic and family violence and sexual assault programs are included in this work. It found that behaviour change programs should not be considered on their own, but instead these programs must be considered in the wider system. Researchers in both the domestic and family violence and sexual assault fields have cautioned against the use of or reliance on recidivism rates as a measure of effectiveness. So we also need to think about what counts as success and from whose perspective are we talking when we think about success. That caution's primarily because recidivism is viewed as a narrow measure in the former, in terms of recidivism. Sorry, reliance as a... in terms of domestic and family violence, yeah, it's viewed as a narrow measure, and in relation to sexual assault, it's recidivism as a measure of success or failure is considered problematic because of significant underreporting and attrition in sexual assault matters. In terms of domestic and family violence perpetrator interventions, programs vary widely in their approach, design, content and mode and manner of delivery. Most programs in Australia are voluntary group-based programs. Most evaluations show modest but positive results, noting though that generalisations are difficult because of the quality or variance in methodology. There's no evidence to suggest that either psychoeducational approach or the cognitive behaviour therapy approach to perpetrator programs are more effective than the other. Perpetrators that are assessed as eligible for programs often disengage from the program where the program availability is limited and wait lists are used. So, you know, with the point that Thea was making about insufficient programs available and so on, if, you know, people are expected to wait around for a program, chances are they won't engage at all. Some evidence to suggest that recidivism of offenders that do not self-refer or are not mandated to attend perpetrator change programs may be reduced by the use of second responder programs. Second responder programs follow up perpetrators to encourage them to seek support and provide referrals to intervention programs. And there's been some work on the interface and role of child protection systems in perpetrator interventions in the UK and in North America, including the work of David Mandel. And some of you may be familiar with the work of David Mandel, since he's been doing quite a bit of work in Australia with governments in looking at improving the child protection system, so that the child protection system is responding better to domestic and family violence than it has been in the past. And holding perpetrators accountable, not victims responsible for the protection of children. In contrast to domestic and family violence programs, there's little debate in regard to the most appropriate program approaches for sex offenders, with most programs utilising cognitive behavioural therapy techniques. Both in Australia and overseas, sex offender programs tend to be group-based voluntary CBT programs run by corrective services. In Australia, sex offender programs are well established in the correctional setting in every state and territory. Is that right? There are also a number of sex offender maintenance programs aimed at reducing perpetrators' risks of reoffending. Beyond the established programs, there are also some circles of support and accountability, or COSA programs, enhanced social support to high-risk offenders rather than interventions per se. Sex offender programs have been found to be usually effective in reducing recidivism. However, there are a number of limitations to these evaluations, including that there's less evidence of effectiveness of programs for offenders who've committed adult sex offences compared to those who commit offences against children. Adult sexualised offences. Thank you, Alan. I'll be very careful with my language in future. Okay, I've got 10 minutes left. So this is a map that you probably can't see very well from that, but this is part 2 of the two-part landscapes, ANRO's landscapes, about current state of knowledge and perpetrator pathways through the system in each of the jurisdictions. So this is an example. I'm not going to show you all 8. So the paper highlights that there are many similarities between the jurisdictions, including that legislative provisions for interim protection orders, consent-based orders and police-issued intervention orders are available in many, if not all, states. The provision of perpetrator programs through non-government organisations, so particularly this is in relation to domestic and family violence, and a mix of court-mandated and voluntary programs. So perpetrator pathways for domestic and family violence is typically through the civil justice system, and there may also be, or there is supposed to be, but rarely is, also criminal, concurrent criminal law application where there's offences that constitute a criminal offence in jurisdictions like Queensland that have a criminal code. The criminal code is supposed to be used in conjunction with the civil domestic violence protection order system, but rarely is. But certainly a breach of a protection order then brings it into the criminal justice realm. In regard to sexual violence, sexualised assault, in contrast to the civil and criminal legal pathways for domestic and family violence, sexualised assault perpetrators' interventions occur within the criminal justice system. It's not news to you. Following the court process, there's no contact or engagement with victims or victims of sexualised assault when perpetrators are engaged in sexualised offender programs. Contact with and linking the provision of support to victims of domestic and family violence is an integral component of domestic and family violence men's behaviour change programs. So that's a significant difference between those sexual assault and domestic violence areas. So despite the similarities and crossover between sexualised assault and domestic and family violence, and noting that many women experience intimate partner sexual violence as a component of intimate partner violence, there's little collaboration between the domestic violence and sexual assault sectors, and the research finds that much could be gained by increased collaboration or sharing of information and development of tools and other interventions to be able to support each other's work. I'll probably leave it at that. So I mentioned that we had called for applications for grants, so there's it's over $2 million in grants to be awarded under the ANRO's Perpetrator Interventions research priorities. So the research, the current state of, the state of knowledge papers that I've referred to also in that process identified areas for further research and identified strategic research themes. So the strategic research themes that were identified through that process were, there are four. The first one is system effectiveness, so again the importance of the system in responding effectively to perpetrators of domestic, family and sexualised violence. The second one is effectiveness and interventions, and in terms of effectiveness and interventions, we found that further research is needed to determine how success and effectiveness of programs and systems is defined, in addition to evaluation of specific interventions and developing an improved understanding of how to engage and retain perpetrators in interventions. The third strategic research theme is models to address diversity of perpetrators, and there we've found the need for further research to explore best practice models for responding to perpetrators of sexualised assault and domestic and family violence, including approaches and responses to specific population groups. So again, you know, the need for recognising diversity and the way in which, the context in which violence is occurring, and in no way excusing violence of any kind, but recognising that we, you know, if we can, we'll get better outcomes if we are able to tailor programs around the needs and